Before the roar of the fire, before the clatter of iron pots, there is a moment of absolute stillness. Imagine standing within thick, uneven stone walls that have watched centuries pass in silence. The air is cool, carrying only the faint, dry scent of ancient ash and the memory of yesterday's smoke. Here, in this pause before the day begins, the kitchen breathes on its own. It is a place of shadows and soft morning light, waiting for the first spark to bring it to life. Tonight, we step into the heart of the medieval home, not as workers, but as silent observers of a world long forgotten. Welcome to the space before the fire. If you are listening at night, tell me where you are and what time it is. Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories, where we share slow and gentle stories from history. These stories are made to calm your mind and help you fall asleep. The kitchen stands enclosed within thick stone walls that rise unevenly, each block carrying a slightly different shape pressed into place long ago. The surface is rough, not smooth, catching dim light along edges that feel irregular to the eye. A wide hearth sits along one side, its opening dark and hollow, framed by stones that bear faint stains from earlier fires. The floor stretches outward in worn patches of packed earth, flattened by many quiet footsteps that have passed without leaving clear marks. A narrow opening in the wall allows a pale strand of morning light to enter, touching only a small portion of the interior. The air inside carries a layered presence, cool near the ground yet faintly warmer closer to the hearth where ash still holds a trace of yesterday. There is a dry scent of dust mixed with the softer, lingering memory of smoke that has settled into the stones over time. When a breath moves through the space, it does not travel freely but seems to drift, brushing against surfaces before fading. The faint light entering from the wall opening brings with it a gentle shift in brightness, enough to reveal particles suspended in the air, moving in slow, uncertain paths. Somewhere within the quiet, a slight shift occurs, almost unnoticed at first. The light changes its angle as time moves forward, stretching a little farther across the floor than before. Shadows adjust in response, not suddenly, but with a gradual easing into new positions. A small fragment of ash near the hearth loosens and settles, creating a faint disturbance that disappears as quickly as it formed. The room does not remain fixed in one state, but instead carries a slow unfolding of tiny changes that pass without drawing attention. To stand within this space is to feel a kind of quiet awareness that does not demand thought but gently invites it. The room seems to hold traces of what has come before, not as clear memories, but as impressions embedded in its surfaces. There is a sense that the kitchen is not defined only by the work that happens later, but by this earlier moment, when it exists without purpose or expectation. In this pause before activity, the space feels complete in itself, offering a calm presence that does not need to be explained. The ceiling rests low above the room, formed from darkened beams that stretch across from wall to wall, their surfaces marked by years of quiet exposure to smoke. Each beam carries a slightly curved line, shaped not by design but by the slow influence of time and weight. Between them, narrow gaps reveal the underside of the upper structure, where faint traces of dust gather in uneven lines. Near the far wall, a small recess is carved into the stone, its edges worn smooth by contact, offering a shallow space where objects may once have been placed. The doorway remains open, framed by thick stone that softens at the edges, leading outward into a space not yet visible. The air near the doorway feels different, carrying a faint hint of the outside that contrasts gently with the enclosed atmosphere of the room. A cooler current drifts inward, bringing with it the subtle scent of damp earth and distant vegetation. This movement is not steady, but arrives in quiet intervals, brushing lightly across the interior before fading again. The scent of ash near the hearth softens in response, blending with the fresher air in a way that shifts the overall feeling of the space. Even the light seems to respond, growing slightly clearer near the entrance, where it meets the incoming air. A faint sound enters, so soft that it seems almost imagined at first. It may be the distant movement of something beyond the walls, or the subtle adjustment of the structure itself as it settles under its own weight. The sound does not repeat, but it leaves behind a slight awareness that the room is connected to a wider world beyond its boundaries. The light continues its gradual movement, reaching a little farther across the floor, touching new surfaces that were previously hidden in shadow. The transition is quiet, but it alters the balance of the room in small, continuous ways. Within this gentle shifting, there is a sense of the kitchen as a place that holds both separation and connection. It stands apart from the outside, enclosed and contained, yet never entirely isolated from what surrounds it. The doorway, the light, and the faint movement of air create a quiet exchange between inside and outside, allowing the space to feel both sheltered and open at the same time. In this moment before any human presence returns, the kitchen carries its own quiet rhythm, shaped not by action, but by the subtle interplay of elements that pass through it. Along one wall, the surface changes where the stone meets a section of rough plaster, applied unevenly and now marked by faint cracks that spread in thin lines. The plaster holds a softer tone than the surrounding stone, catching light in a gentler way, as if it absorbs rather than reflects. Near the base, the floor meets the wall with no clear boundary, only a gradual blending where dust has gathered in a shallow line. In one corner, a wooden surface stands slightly raised from the ground, its edges worn smooth, suggesting long use without revealing any recent activity. The space is shaped not by decoration, but by the quiet practicality of its construction. A different layer of sensation settles closer to the floor, where the air feels heavier and more grounded. There is a faint coolness that lingers in the earth beneath, rising gently upward and touching anything that rests near it. The scent here is less defined, carrying only a soft impression of soil and time, as if the ground itself holds a memory that does not fully emerge. When the light reaches this lower space, it appears dimmer, softened by the slight haze that collects near the surface. The room offers different sensations depending on where one stands, each area carrying its own subtle presence. Another quiet shift unfolds as the light continues its slow passage, now touching the wooden surface in the corner. The grain becomes visible, revealing lines that curve and intersect in patterns formed long before the wood was placed here. A thin layer of dust stirs slightly, not from any clear cause, but as if responding to the gradual change in warmth. The faint sound of something settling deep within the structure echoes briefly, then fades without repetition. These movements remain small, yet they create a sense that the space is never entirely still, always moving in ways that are easy to overlook. To observe this corner of the kitchen is to notice how time seems to gather rather than pass. The surfaces do not tell a clear story, yet they suggest a long accumulation of presence that cannot be traced to a single moment. There is a quiet depth here, where each mark and texture feels connected to something beyond immediate understanding. The kitchen, even before it fills with activity, holds a layered existence that invites attention without requiring it, offering a calm sense of continuity that unfolds gently within the space. Near the center of the room, the floor opens into a wider stretch where the earth has been pressed more firmly, forming a shallow, uneven surface that reflects long patterns of use. The ground carries faint impressions, not distinct enough to trace, yet varied enough to suggest different movements that have passed across it over time. Small fragments of ash and dust rest lightly across this space, gathered in soft patches that shift almost invisibly. Toward one side, a slight dip in the floor catches a trace of shadow, giving the surface a quiet variation in depth. The room feels grounded here, anchored by the weight of what lies beneath. The air in this central space feels more open, less shaped by walls or corners, allowing a gentler flow that moves across the floor in subtle currents. There is a faint warmth rising from the earth, not strong, but present enough to soften the cooler tones found near the edges. The scent here blends quietly, carrying neither the strong trace of ash nor the freshness from the doorway, but something in between, less defined and more diffuse. When standing in this part of the room, the senses do not focus on a single detail, but instead take in a broader, more balanced presence that settles without drawing attention to itself. A small shift occurs as a narrow line of light reaches further inward, stretching across the center and revealing textures that were previously less visible. The uneven surface becomes clearer, showing slight ridges and depressions that catch the light in different ways. A faint movement of air follows, passing across the ground and lifting a few particles that drift briefly before settling again. The change is quiet, yet it alters how the space is perceived, bringing forward details that had remained hidden in softer shadow. There is a quiet sense that this central area gathers the presence of the entire room, holding together the different elements without separating them. It does not stand out as a distinct feature, yet it feels essential, as if it carries the shared weight of everything around it. In this space, the kitchen feels less like a collection of parts and more like a single, continuous environment. The absence of activity does not leave it empty, but instead allows this quiet unity to become more noticeable, offering a calm and steady presence that does not require explanation. Along the far side of the kitchen, the wall curves slightly inward where the stones were set without strict alignment, creating a surface that feels subtly uneven when followed by the eye. A narrow slit higher up allows a second, thinner thread of light to enter, distinct from the lower opening near the doorway. This light does not spread widely, but falls in a concentrated line, touching a small section of the wall before fading into softer shadow. Beneath it, the stone shows faint discoloration, a quiet record of long exposure to shifting brightness. The shape of this side of the room feels less defined, as if it gently resists symmetry. The air near this upper opening carries a different quality, lighter and more delicate, as though it has traveled a shorter distance from outside. There is a faint dryness here, mixed with a subtle hint of warmth that gathers where the light rests. When the air moves through this narrow space, it creates a barely noticeable change in sensation, like a soft brush that passes without lingering. The scent in this area is faint, almost absent, allowing the senses to rest without focusing on any single impression. It is a quieter kind of presence, one that does not announce itself but still alters the atmosphere in small ways. As time continues to pass, the thin line of light begins to shift, sliding slowly along the wall and revealing new textures as it moves. Small irregularities in the stone surface come into view, each one catching the light for a brief moment before returning to shadow. A faint settling sound follows, perhaps from within the wall itself, as if the structure adjusts gently under its own weight. The change is gradual, almost imperceptible, yet it creates a sense of motion that quietly transforms how this part of the room is experienced. There is something in this upper corner that suggests a quieter form of attention, where details appear only for a moment before receding again. It does not invite constant observation, but instead offers brief glimpses that come and go without warning. In this way, the kitchen holds not only steady presence, but also passing moments that cannot be held for long. This shifting quality adds a subtle depth to the space, allowing it to feel layered and alive in a way that unfolds slowly, without urgency or demand. Near the threshold where the doorway meets the interior, the stone changes again, worn more deeply along the lower edges where countless crossings have softened its surface. The frame is thick, its inner sides slightly hollowed, creating a gentle curve that catches both light and shadow at once. The ground just inside the entrance carries a faint transition, where the packed earth shifts in tone, marking a quiet boundary between inside and outside. Beyond the opening, only a pale brightness can be seen, offering no clear image of what lies beyond, yet suggesting a wider space waiting just out of view. The air at this boundary feels layered, as if two different qualities meet and settle together without fully blending. A cooler breath arrives from outside, carrying a faint trace of moisture, while the interior holds a softer warmth that lingers close to the ground. When these two meet, there is a gentle shift in sensation, not sharp or sudden, but gradual and balanced. The scent here is mixed in a subtle way, neither fully defined by the room nor by the world beyond, creating a quiet middle space where the senses pause rather than focus. A small movement occurs as the light from outside grows slightly brighter, extending further into the doorway and touching the inner edges of the stone frame. Shadows pull back in response, revealing textures that had been less visible before. A faint current of air follows, passing through the opening and moving lightly across the floor, carrying a few particles that drift inward before settling again. The change does not alter the space dramatically, yet it introduces a soft sense of transition, as if the room is slowly preparing for something not yet present. Standing at this threshold, there is a feeling of quiet anticipation, though nothing has begun and nothing is required to begin. The kitchen exists here in a moment that feels both complete and open, holding its form while allowing the possibility of what may enter. This boundary does not divide as much as it connects, offering a gentle passage between two states of being. In this final observation, the space reveals itself not as empty or waiting, but as quietly ready, holding within it the calm before any action takes shape. The hearth forms a wide, open mouth along the wall, built from heavy stones that press inward toward a darkened center. Each stone is shaped differently, some larger and uneven, others smaller and more fitted, creating a rough boundary that feels both deliberate and worn. The edges are softened by time, their corners rounded slightly where heat and touch have passed again and again. Above, the opening rises into a shadowed space where smoke once traveled upward, leaving faint streaks that stretch toward the ceiling. The surface beneath is darker than the surrounding floor, marked by layers of ash that have settled into the earth. A faint scent lingers close to the hearth, carrying traces of burned wood, dry charcoal, and something older that has settled deeply into the stone. The air here feels warmer than the rest of the room, though no fire is present, as if the stones hold a quiet memory of heat. When standing nearby, there is a subtle dryness that touches the throat, mixed with a soft, dusty texture that drifts through each breath. The scent does not rise sharply, but unfolds gently, blending with the surrounding air in a way that feels familiar rather than strong. A small change unfolds as a thin line of light reaches the edge of the hearth, revealing details that remain hidden in deeper shadow. The blackened surfaces begin to show faint variations in tone, where soot has gathered more heavily in some places and less in others. A loose fragment of ash shifts slightly, settling into a new position with a movement so quiet it barely registers. The light continues its slow advance, tracing the uneven edges of the stone and bringing forward textures that seem to emerge only for a moment before softening again. To look at the hearth is to sense a quiet accumulation of time that cannot be easily separated into moments. The marks along the stone suggest repeated use, yet they do not tell a clear sequence of events. Instead, they create a layered presence, where each trace blends into the next without standing apart. The hearth feels less like an object and more like a place that has absorbed countless small actions, holding them in a way that does not demand attention, but gently invites a slower kind of noticing. The inner curve of the hearth draws the eye inward, where the stones recede slightly to form a shallow hollow that once held the center of the fire. The surface here is darker and more compact, as if it has been pressed by heat into a firmer shape over time. Along the sides, small ledges appear where the stones meet at uneven heights, creating narrow places where fragments of ash have gathered. The back wall of the hearth leans inward at a slight angle, its texture rougher and more deeply marked, suggesting repeated contact with flame and smoke that has left its quiet imprint. Closer to this inner space, the air feels heavier, carrying a deeper layer of scent that is more concentrated than the edges. There is a faint bitterness in it, mixed with the dry, powdery presence of old ash that settles softly in the breath. When the air shifts, it carries a delicate warmth that feels less like heat and more like a memory of it, lingering just beneath the surface of sensation. The silence here feels thicker, as though sound does not travel as freely within the hollow, creating a subtle difference in how the space is experienced. A gradual change becomes visible as the light from the room reaches further into the hearth, touching the inner surfaces with a dim, diffused glow. The darker areas begin to reveal slight variations, where the soot forms thin layers that overlap in uneven patterns. A faint line appears along the back wall, marking where heat once rose more intensely, leaving behind a deeper shade. The ash at the base shifts almost imperceptibly, responding to the faint movement of air that passes through the opening. These changes are quiet, yet they bring a sense of gentle unfolding within the space. There is a feeling that the hearth holds a kind of inward focus, drawing attention not outward but deeper into itself. It does not present a clear story, yet it suggests a long presence shaped by repeated moments that have settled into one another. The space feels contained, almost introspective, as if it carries its own quiet awareness separate from the rest of the room. In this way, the hearth becomes more than a structure, offering a subtle sense of depth that invites a slower, more attentive way of seeing. The upper edge of the hearth opens into a narrowing passage where the stonework shifts from broad, grounded shapes into a more vertical arrangement. Here, the stones are stacked with a tighter fit, their surfaces darker and more polished by the steady passage of smoke over many years. Thin streaks stretch upward, tracing paths that are not straight but gently curved, following the natural pull of rising air. Along one side, a slight overhang forms where a stone extends outward, casting a small shadow beneath it. This upper section feels more enclosed, guiding the eye upward toward a space that fades into dimness. The air in this higher part carries a finer quality, lighter yet tinged with a sharper scent that feels closer to the residue of burned wood. It is less earthy than the base of the hearth, more refined in its presence, as if the heavier elements have settled below while the lighter traces have risen and remained here. When the air shifts, it creates a faint movement that brushes along the upper surfaces, stirring a subtle dryness that lingers for a moment before dispersing. The sensation here is less grounded, offering a different layer of the hearth's atmosphere. A quiet transition unfolds as the light from below reaches upward, touching the lower edges of this vertical passage and gradually revealing the textures above. The darker streaks begin to separate into finer lines, showing where layers of soot have built up in delicate patterns. A small particle loosens from the surface and drifts downward, its movement slow and almost weightless before it disappears into the shadows below. The change is gentle, yet it brings a sense of connection between the upper and lower parts of the hearth, linking them through this gradual movement. There is something in this upward extension that suggests a quiet direction, a subtle sense of flow that is not immediately visible but can be felt through careful attention. The hearth does not only occupy the ground, but reaches beyond it, carrying traces of what has passed through it over time. This vertical presence adds a different dimension to the space, inviting a broader awareness that moves from the base towards something less defined above. It offers a quiet reminder that even within a contained structure, there is a gentle sense of passage that continues beyond what can be clearly seen. Along the front edge of the hearth, a flat stone extends outward slightly, forming a narrow ledge that separates the inner hollow from the open floor. Its surface is smoother than the surrounding stones, shaped by repeated contact that has softened its texture over time. Faint scratches run across it in uneven directions, intersecting in patterns that suggest many different uses without revealing their exact purpose. The edge of this stone dips gently in one place, creating a shallow curve that catches a small band of light. Around it, tiny fragments of ash gather in thin layers, outlining the shape of the ledge without covering it entirely. When attention settles on this edge, the sensation becomes more immediate, as if this part of the hearth holds a closer connection to touch. The air here feels slightly warmer than the floor beyond, carrying a faint trace of fine dust that moves lightly when disturbed. There is a quiet dryness that lingers along the surface, not sharp, but present enough to be noticed. If a hand were to rest here, it would meet a texture that feels both firm and worn, holding a subtle warmth that seems to rise slowly from within rather than from any active source. A small shift occurs as the light continues to move, sliding across the ledge and revealing the shallow depressions that had been less visible before. The scratches begin to stand out more clearly, catching the light at different angles and creating a faint interplay of brightness and shadow. A thin line of ash near the edge loosens and drifts downward, breaking apart as it falls and settling softly onto the floor below. The movement is slight, yet it changes how the surface appears, bringing new details forward while allowing others to fade. There is a quiet sense that this edge marks a subtle boundary, not dividing the hearth from the room, but connecting the two in a quiet, continuous way. It feels like a place where actions once gathered, where the inner space of the hearth met the wider presence of the kitchen. Even in this moment of stillness, the ledge carries a quiet awareness of that connection, holding traces of interaction without needing to display them clearly. It offers a gentle reminder that the hearth is not isolated, but part of a larger rhythm that extends beyond its own form. To one side of the hearth, a vertical seam between two stones draws a narrow line that runs from the floor upward into the darker passage above. The gap is slight, barely wide enough to be noticed at first, yet it creates a subtle division in the surface that changes how the stones meet. Along this seam, the edges are more sharply defined, as if they have resisted the softening seen elsewhere. A faint trace of residue gathers within the line, darker than the surrounding stone, forming a thin boundary that separates one surface from another without fully breaking their connection. The air near this seam feels cooler, as though it holds less of the warmth that lingers closer to the center of the hearth. There is a delicate stillness here, not heavy, but quiet in a way that allows small details to become more noticeable. The scent is lighter, carrying only a faint suggestion of ash, mixed with the dry mineral presence of the stone itself. When the air moves, it does so gently along this narrow line, creating a subtle shift in sensation that is felt more as a change in texture than in temperature. A slight movement occurs as the light reaches the seam, illuminating its edges and revealing the fine variations along its length. Tiny grains of dust within the gap catch the light briefly, then settle again into the narrow space. The contrast between the two stones becomes more apparent, showing how each surface holds a slightly different tone and texture. As the light continues its slow progression, the seam appears to shift in prominence, at times standing out clearly, then blending back into the larger surface of the hearth. There is something in this narrow line that suggests a quiet separation within unity, a place where two elements meet without fully merging. It does not disrupt the overall form of the hearth, yet it introduces a subtle awareness of difference within a single structure. In observing this seam, there is a sense that even the most solid forms carry within them small distinctions that shape how they are experienced. It offers a gentle reminder that the hearth, like the space around it, is composed of many parts that come together without losing their individual presence. At the base of the hearth, where the inner hollow meets the ground, the surface gathers into a shallow bed of fine ash and darker fragments that have settled over time. The texture here is softer than the surrounding floor, forming a loose layer that shifts slightly under its own weight. Small pieces of charcoal rest among the ash, irregular in shape and scattered without pattern, their edges still defined despite long stillness. Along the outer edge, the ash thins gradually, blending into the packed earth of the kitchen floor, creating a gentle transition between the hearth and the wider space beyond. The air close to this lower layer carries a quieter presence, as if the scent has settled downward and become more subdued. There is a faint dryness that lingers near the surface, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady enough to be noticed when attention rests here. The smell of old burning is softer, mixed with the earthy tone of the ground beneath, forming a subtle combination that feels grounded and contained. When a slight movement of air passes across this layer, it lifts a delicate trace of dust that drifts briefly before returning to rest. A small change unfolds as the light reaches this lower area, revealing the fine variations within the ash that were not visible before. The surface appears uneven, with slight rises and dips that catch the light in different ways. A fragment of charcoal shifts almost imperceptibly, settling deeper into the softer layer beneath it. The movement is quiet, yet it alters the arrangement in a way that feels natural, as if the surface is slowly adjusting to its own form over time. There is a quiet sense that this base holds the deepest trace of what has passed through the hearth, gathering the remains of many unseen moments into a single, quiet layer. It does not present these traces clearly, but allows them to rest together, forming a subtle record that is felt rather than read. In this final observation, the hearth reveals itself not only through its structure, but through what it has received and held, offering a calm and grounded presence that settles gently into the surrounding space. A thin beam of light enters the kitchen through a narrow opening high in the wall, cutting softly across the darker interior. It does not spread evenly, but forms a pale column that touches only certain surfaces, leaving others in a muted shade. Within this light, faint traces of smoke gather in uneven layers, rising from the hearth in slow, curling lines. The smoke does not move in a single direction, but drifts gently, responding to currents that are too subtle to see directly. Together, The light and smoke create a shifting pattern that rests lightly over the stone and earth. The air carries a quiet mixture of sensations, where warmth and coolness meet without forming a clear boundary. There is a soft dryness in the smoke that lingers in the breath, paired with a faint warmth that settles close to the skin. The light brings a slight clarity to the space, allowing the eyes to follow the delicate movement of particles suspended within it. The scent is layered, not sharp, but gently present, combining traces of ash, wood, and the enclosed air of the room. Each breath feels shaped by this mixture, creating a calm and steady rhythm of sensation. A subtle change unfolds as the light shifts its angle, moving slowly across the interior and altering how the smoke is revealed. The drifting lines become more visible in some places, then soften as they pass beyond the reach of the beam. A faint current of air enters from the doorway, causing the smoke to bend slightly, forming new patterns that rise and dissolve without pause. The movement is continuous but quiet, never settling into a fixed shape, always adjusting to the smallest change in the surrounding air. There is a sense that the space is gently shaped by these elements, where light, smoke, and air come together to form an atmosphere that feels both present and passing. The room is not defined only by its structure, but by this shifting interplay that softens its edges and deepens its character. In this moment, the kitchen feels less like a solid place and more like a quiet gathering of subtle movements, offering a calm awareness that unfolds without needing to be held or understood. Near the upper space above the hearth, the light thins into a softer glow, spreading gently as it meets the darker passage where smoke gathers before rising higher. The edges of this glow are not clearly defined, but fade gradually into the surrounding dimness, creating a layered effect that changes how the surfaces are seen. The stone above appears less solid here, its texture softened by the fine haze that lingers in the air. Smoke traces move across this area in delicate strands, sometimes overlapping, sometimes separating, forming patterns that shift with quiet irregularity. The sensation in this higher part of the room carries a lighter quality, where the air feels less grounded and more diffuse. There is a faint warmth that touches the face, paired with a softness that comes from the suspended particles moving through the light. Breathing here feels different, as if the air has been gently altered by its passage through heat and smoke. The scent is more subtle, less dense than near the hearth, carrying only a quiet trace of what has risen upward and spread thinly through the space. A gradual adjustment becomes visible as the smoke responds to a slight change in the flow of air, bending and stretching into new shapes that dissolve almost as soon as they form. The light follows this movement, catching certain strands and leaving others less visible, creating a shifting contrast that draws attention without holding it. A faint opening of brightness appears for a moment as the smoke thins, then closes again as new layers drift into place. These changes are continuous, yet gentle, forming a quiet rhythm that unfolds without interruption. There is a feeling that this upper space carries a sense of quiet passage, where elements rise, transform, and fade without leaving clear traces behind. It suggests a kind of movement that is not measured or defined, but simply experienced as it happens. The interaction between light and smoke here feels less like an event and more like a quiet process, one that shapes the atmosphere in ways that are subtle but deeply present. In this way, the kitchen becomes a place where even the air participates in a slow and unfolding awareness. Closer to the doorway, the light takes on a different character, entering at a lower angle and spreading more widely across the interior. It meets the drifting smoke in a softer way, illuminating broader areas rather than narrow lines. The edges of objects become less defined here, as the haze gently blurs their outlines. The floor, the lower walls, and the edge of the hearth all appear slightly altered, as if viewed through a thin veil. The light does not remain fixed, but stretches gradually, reaching new parts of the room while leaving others behind. The air in this lower space feels more active, carrying a faint movement that can be sensed along the skin. There is a gentle mixture of cooler air from outside and the lingering warmth from within, creating a balanced sensation that shifts subtly with each breath. The scent here is lighter, touched by the outside air, yet still holding a quiet trace of smoke that softens the overall experience. The presence of moving air brings a sense of openness, allowing the atmosphere to feel less enclosed and more connected to what lies beyond the doorway. A small change occurs as a slightly stronger current of air enters, causing the smoke to lift and stretch in new directions. The patterns that once drifted upward now tilt and curve, forming wider shapes that move across the room before thinning again. The light responds to this shift, revealing new layers of movement that had not been visible before. A faint clearing appears in one part of the space as the smoke disperses, allowing the surfaces beneath to emerge more clearly for a brief moment. There is a quiet sense that this part of the room carries a gentle exchange between inside and outside, where the air does not remain contained but moves freely between the two. The light and smoke become part of this exchange, shifting in response to each subtle change in movement. In this way, the kitchen feels less enclosed and more open, shaped by a constant yet quiet interaction that brings a soft sense of connection to the wider world beyond its walls. Along the mid-level of the room, where the light softens and the smoke drifts more evenly, the space takes on a layered appearance that sits between brightness and shadow. The walls here reveal a gentle blending of tones, where darker stone meets a lighter haze that shifts slowly across its surface. The outlines of objects lose their sharpness, not fully obscured, but softened just enough to change how they are seen. The smoke spreads in wider forms, less defined than near the hearth, creating a quiet veil that moves across the room without settling into one shape. The sensation in this middle space feels balanced, neither heavy nor light, but gently suspended between the two. The air touches the skin with a faint warmth that is not constant, shifting slightly as the smoke passes through it. Breathing here feels steady, shaped by the soft presence of particles that drift without urgency. The scent is evenly spread, not concentrated in one place, allowing it to be noticed without drawing focus. It creates a quiet atmosphere that feels present in every part of the room, blending all elements into a single experience. A gradual change begins as the smoke thickens slightly in one area, forming a denser layer that alters how the light passes through it. The brightness dims just enough to create a deeper contrast, revealing subtle movements within the haze. The smoke then begins to spread again, thinning as it moves outward, restoring a softer balance between light and shadow. This cycle continues quietly, with no clear beginning or end, allowing the space to shift in ways that feel natural and unforced. There is a sense that this middle layer of the room holds a quiet harmony, where light, smoke, and air meet without competing for attention. Each element contributes to the atmosphere, shaping it in small, continuous ways that are easy to overlook. In this gentle balance, the kitchen feels less like a place defined by structure and more like a space shaped by presence, where even the smallest movement carries a subtle meaning that unfolds without interruption. Near the ceiling, the smoke gathers into thinner, more delicate strands that stretch outward before dissolving into the darker space above. The light reaches this area with less strength, arriving as a faint glow that touches only the lower edges of the beams. The wooden surfaces appear softened, their darker tones blending with the fine haze that lingers just below them. The smoke here moves in narrow lines, rising and spreading gently, creating a subtle layering that gives the upper space a quiet depth that is not immediately noticed. The air at this height feels lighter, almost fragile, carrying only the faintest trace of warmth. There is a soft dryness that lingers without becoming sharp, allowing each breath to pass easily without resistance. The scent is very subtle, barely present, as if it has thinned while rising through the space. When attention rests here, the sensation becomes less about individual details and more about a quiet openness, where the air feels less dense and more dispersed. A small shift occurs as the rising smoke begins to thin further, spreading out as it reaches the highest part of the room. The lines that were once more visible begin to fade, blending into the dimness near the ceiling. At the same time, a slight change in air movement causes a gentle redirection, with some strands drifting sideways before continuing upward. The light responds by revealing these movements briefly, then losing them again as they pass beyond its reach. There is a quiet sense that this upper space carries a feeling of release, where what rises does not remain but continues beyond what can be seen. The smoke does not settle here, but moves through, suggesting a passage that extends past the visible room. This creates a subtle awareness that the kitchen is connected to something beyond its boundaries, not through solid forms, but through the quiet movement of air and light that passes upward and away. Near the floor, where the light grows softer and the smoke settles into wider, slower shapes, the atmosphere gathers into a gentle layer that moves close to the ground. The edges of the room appear slightly muted here, as if the air itself creates a thin covering over the surfaces. The earth floor reflects a dim version of the light above, not clearly, but enough to suggest its presence. The smoke no longer rises in narrow lines, but spreads outward in faint, low forms that drift across the space, shaping how the lower part of the room is seen. The sensation in this lower space feels more grounded, with a subtle weight that rests closer to the body. The air carries a soft warmth mixed with the faint coolness of the earth beneath, creating a balanced feeling that is neither heavy nor light. The scent is more noticeable here, though still gentle, holding traces of ash and wood that have settled downward. Breathing in this space feels slower, as if the air invites a quieter rhythm that follows the steady movement of the smoke. A gradual shift takes place as the smoke begins to thin near the floor, dispersing into smaller traces that become less visible over time. The light follows this change, reaching more clearly across the ground and revealing textures that had been softened by the haze. A faint movement of air passes through, lifting a few particles before they settle again into the surface below. The transition is subtle, yet it alters the way the space feels, bringing a quiet clarity to the lower part of the room. There is a sense that this final layer completes the atmosphere of the kitchen, bringing together the movements of light, smoke, and air into a single, quiet presence. It does not stand apart from the rest, but connects with it, forming a continuous flow that moves from floor to ceiling and beyond. In this gentle unfolding, the space reveals itself as something shaped not only by structure, but by the quiet interaction of elements that shift and blend over time.